Over a period of 6 days in August 1971, the basement of Stanford University's psychology building was transformed from a hallway filled with graduate student offices into a makeshift prison. And who was locked away in this prison? A small group of male college students, and acting as guards was another small group of male college students. Overseeing all of this was the prison superintendent, researcher Philip Zimbardo, the principal investigator of a study aimed at looking into how situational forces and social roles transform individual behavior. The study was intended to last for 2 weeks, but ended early, in fact, on the 6th day. The results of the study were astounding, and it remains one of the most frequently discussed psychological experiments in early psychology classes. Zimbardo has since been called as an expert witness in several trials involving the treatment of prisoners, with one of the most recent being the court-martial trial of U.S. service members due to their treatment of prisoners at the Abu Ghraib prison during the early years of the war in Iraq. Today we look deep into the aim of the original experiment, what actually happened, what went wrong, and how it is applied to other situations like the incident with Abu Ghraib. We will also be looking into the criticisms and growing reports that this original study was completely flawed and invalid on this week's episode of Your Mind On, the Stanford Prison Experiment. Welcome back, everyone, to another week here on the Your Mind On podcast, where each week I, John Shaw, pick a topic within the world of psychology, dig into the research, and present what I have found to all of you. This week, we once again will look at power dynamics with authority and how conformity can happen in the worst possible ways. Happy New Year to all of you. I hope 2026 is off to a great start, and I hope it keeps rolling with the good. 2025 was a difficult year for many people, and I, for one, am glad to be leaving it behind me and venturing into a new and more promising year. Quick housekeeping note here before we get started today. I have officially started working on my master's degree in clinical mental health, which over time is going to help me evolve the content of the show and, I hope, sculpt it into something truly great for everyone that listens in. Right now, my plan is to continue cranking out episodes each week alongside my studies, as hopefully I can overlap some of the topics with what I'm studying in school. However, the master's program is pretty intensive, and along with all of the other responsibilities I have in life, there may be weeks where I just simply cannot get an episode out, so I would like to apologize in advance for any time that might happen, and I also want to thank you for being understanding on that. I do hope that I will get a chance to sit down and work through a few episodes so that I'll have a nice buffer for those times when I just don't have time to record, and that way I don't miss any release dates. And now let's dive into the world of the Stanford Prison Experiment. As we discussed in the episode on Stanley Milgram and his obedience study, there has long been a debate about why seemingly normal people could carry out such horrific acts under the right circumstances. For Milgram, this was focused on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. But for Zimbardo, it was focused more on the prison system. His thoughts were that it strongly depended on the situation and the social roles that people find themselves in. Essentially, that when people are put into a position of authority or power over other people, specifically in a toxic environment, these people can go from kind-hearted, generous people to, well, monsters. And so he set out to test this idea. Zimbardo's team recruited 24 male college students through ads in the newspaper, offering $15 per day for participating in a 2-week-long study. These volunteers were screened for psychological stability and health before being randomly assigned a role in the experiment, either as a prison guard or as a prisoner. In Jordan Hall, the psychology building at Stanford, a 35-foot section of the basement was transformed into a mock prison that had 3 7-foot by 10-foot unlit cells, a small corridor to act as the prison yard, a closet that would be used for solitary confinement, which was also known as the hole, and separate quarters for the guards. Everyone assigned the role of prison guard was given a standard uniform to wear that included khaki pants and shirt, whistles, wooden batons, and mirrored sunglasses. The prisoners were forced to wear smocks that fit poorly with no underwear, stocking caps to simulate shaved heads, and a chain around one ankle. The prisoners were also assigned ID numbers, which were sewn onto their uniforms, and the guards were instructed to only address the prisoners by their assigned ID number and never their name. On Saturday, August 14th, 1971, the team finished setting up the mock cells, and those participants that were assigned the role of guard were required to attend an orientation. At that orientation, they were briefed on their roles and were instructed to maintain order in the mock prison without using any physical force. The next day, the experiment officially began. To make the experiment as realistic as possible, each of the participants that were assigned the role of prisoner were arrested at their homes by the Palo Alto Police Department and taken to the real police station to be formally booked, including being fingerprinted and having their mugshots taken. They were then transported to the Stanford County Jail for processing. The police even used their sirens and lights during the transportation. Once at the mock prison, the prisoners were systematically stripped naked, searched for contraband, and deloused. During the 1970s, delousing was done with harsh chemicals that were intended as a hygiene practice to kill off any lice or other parasites to prevent them from spreading around the prison. In terms of the Stanford experiment, this was done with a simple spray that did not use any harsh chemicals that the actual prison systems used. Now, these were typical college students that likely would not have had any parasites like lice, so why perform the delousing? It was actually a psychological measure. It was intended to be dehumanizing because the prisoners were treated as if they were unclean, dirty creatures instead of humans with dignity. It also forced the young men to stand naked while a guard sprayed their bodies, emphasizing their total lack of privacy and control. After the delousing process, the prisoners were given their smocks to wear. These were basically poor-fitting dresses, almost like hospital gowns. Researchers noted that after putting on these smocks, the prisoners all changed the way they would walk and sit, appearing to be emasculated. The prisoners had also been issued the nylon stocking caps to simulate shaving their heads, and they were required to wear them at all times. Next, the prisoners were formally greeted by the warden, an undergraduate student named David Jaffe, who gave a speech intended to show the seriousness of their offense and to reinforce their new status as inmates. He also read a list of 17 prison rules. These rules included things like making smoking a privilege that would only be granted at the guards' discretion. Today, that might not seem like as big of an issue for most people, but this was the early 1970s when it was far more common for people to smoke regularly, so it was a much bigger deal to them. During the first two shifts of the guards, most of them were not fitting into the role very much. They were not dominant or abusive toward the prisoners, and recordings from day one show some of the guards were even giggling while trying to encourage the prisoners to take the rules seriously. One of the guards even left his post during a prisoner count, thereby failing to require that the inmates follow orders. So from the guards' side of things, they were already failing at the experiment. This prompted Warden Jaffe to intervene by pulling one of the soft guards aside. He pressured the guard to be more active, involved, and tough, because the success of the experiment depended on the guards' ability to make the setting seem like a real prison. It's interesting to note the mirroring here with the Milgram study. The guard was hesitant about fulfilling his role, so a verbal prod from the researcher was used, even using language that closely resembled a prod from Milgram's study. That one being, the experiment requires that you continue. One of the requirements during the study was to conduct counts, where prisoners were lined up to recite their ID numbers. Even on the first day, these were used to humiliate and taunt the prisoners. One guard even recorded that they introduced push-up penalties for any incompetence shown by the prisoners. After the presentation of rules and initial counts, the inmates were sent to their cells for the remainder of the first day. This, again, was intended to be dehumanizing, so it was mandated to the guards to never request, but rather order. The prisoners were not asked to go to their cells, they were ordered to go. Day 2 kicked off early and in a big way. At 2:30 in the morning, the night shift guards conducted a wake-up call using whistles and banging their batons against the cell bars. In a spontaneous act of rebellion, prisoners used their cots to block the cell doors, ripped off their ID numbers from their uniforms, and removed their stocking caps. The inmates openly insulted the guards and refused to leave their cells to eat in the yard. The 3 guards on duty felt that they couldn't handle this rebellion alone and called in the other 6 guards, including those from the morning and afternoon shifts, to increase their numbers. Once the others arrived, they began working to reassert control. The guards used fire extinguishers to spray the inmates as a way of forcing them away from the doors. They broke into cells, stripped the prisoners naked, and removed their mattresses. Finally, the guards determined who the leaders of the rebellion were and put them into the hole for solitary confinement. This act of rebellion was a turning point for the experiment. Where many of the guards had been simply role-playing and were not taking things as seriously as Zimbardo and the researchers wanted, now they were beginning to view the inmates as genuine threats rather than student volunteers. One guard even remarked to another, "These are dangerous prisoners." This shift in thought led the guards to implement more creative and dehumanizing psychological warfare tactics to break prisoner solidarity. During the design of the experiment and selection of participants, there was an option given for all of the participants to be able to withdraw from the study in the event that they no longer wished to participate. And Day 2 saw the first requests to leave the study by a prisoner. Prisoners 1037 and 8612-1 both requested to leave the experiment. However, Zimbardo, in his role as prison superintendent, refused their requests. He informed his research team that he had told them they could only be released for medical or psychiatric reasons. This created a very real feeling of being trapped because the prisoners realized that they were no longer participants in a voluntary study, but were now effectively imprisoned. Because of this refusal, prisoner 8612-1 began planning a way to look like he was having a complete mental breakdown as a way of getting out of the experiment. This set the stage for the first emotional breakdown recorded in the study. Day 3 saw an even bigger shift in the experiment. Where days 1 and 2 were more about physical confrontation with the inmates to try to control them, Day 3 saw a shift toward more psychological means. The guards felt like they needed to break the solidarity of the prisoners, so they established what they referred to as a privilege cell. Initially, the 3 prisoners that were not as prominent in the rebellion or didn't participate at all during Day 2 were moved into this cell. They were given back their prison uniforms and their mattresses. They were also given special, better food to eat in view of the other prisoners who were completely denied food. Then, after 12 hours, the guards switched the privileged prisoners back to the regular cells and moved the rebel leaders into the privileged cell, giving them back their uniforms and beds. But this wasn't about the guards winning back the trust of the prisoners. This was done to create distrust. The rebellious prisoners began to suspect that the privileged inmates were informants or snitches. This helped to destroy prisoner unity. There was also an increase in abuse. Now, the guards were told that they were not allowed to use any kind of physical force against the prisoners, so they began relying even more heavily on humiliation and dehumanization. They began depriving the prisoners of toilets. Instead, the prisoners were given buckets in their cells to use rather than being allowed to use a real toilet. These buckets were kept in the cells with the prisoners, so they had to deal with the smell of their own waste. The number of counts being done was increased throughout the day and included the use of push-ups as punishments during the accounts. Warden Jaffe again pulled a soft guard aside and reprimanded him for not being active enough, and that for the experiment to provide data for prison reform, every guard had to be a tough guard that had to be in the action at all times. The most significant event of the third day was the emotional breakdown and release of Douglas Corpy, prisoner 8612-1. After only 36 hours in the study, Corpy began suffering from acute emotional disturbance, including uncontrollable crying and disorganized thinking. One of the more well-known aspects of the whole study was Corpy screaming, "Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside." Eventually, research assistant Craig Haney released Corpy after realizing his suffering was genuine, which ultimately firmly set the precedence that inmates would only be allowed to leave for medical or psychiatric reasons. Now, it should be noted that there is some debate here on Corpy's exit from the experiment. Zimbardo maintains that the breakdown suffered by Corpy was a real response to the situational pressure. Corpy, however, has claimed in more recent years that he faked the breakdown because he wasn't being allowed to leave the study for his graduate record exam. It was at this point in the entire experiment where things really went off the rails for the researchers. With all of the events of day 3, they actually logged very little information or data. Not because there wasn't anything to log, but because they were preoccupied. There had been a rumor that there would be a mass escape attempt that was being planned by the remaining participants, and so Zimbardo himself and his assistants were busy spending much of the day attempting to prevent this perceived assault. So take a moment to let that fact sink in. Zimbardo, a psychologist leading the study, had become so caught up in his own experiment that he completely neglected recording information to instead prevent an escape attempt from his mock prison. This is how deeply entrenched the participants and researchers actually got. They were so focused on preventing this escape attempt that they even contacted the actual police for help. The experiment had quickly gone off the rails and taken on a life of its own. On Wednesday, August 18th, day 4 of the experiment began. It was on day 4 that the simulation entered a phase of profound psychological fragmentation. Prisoner solidarity was completely destroyed and was replaced by deep-seated mistrust. Remember the privileged cell from day 3? Well, now its full impact was being felt. The prisoners began distancing themselves from one another. The group as a whole was split into 2 separate groups. The first group operated from a position of mistrust and paranoia. They had participated in the rebellion, and they began to believe that the ones that didn't participate were informants. The group that had not participated in the rebellion began to view the more rebellious ones as a threat to the status quo, and believed that if they continued their defiance, it would prevent them all from getting their clothes and mattresses back. The environment itself grew more and more hostile as researchers actively encouraged the guards to use tougher behavior. They didn't want the experiment to become too lenient, so Zimbardo and the warden specifically directed the guards to adopt a hard attitude on day 4. Despite rising tensions, the daily routine of counts and exercises was followed almost exactly as it had on previous days. It was on day 4 that some of the guards continued to develop more dehumanizing punishments. Basically, the guards were beginning to see themselves as puppeteers that could force the inmates to do anything they wanted. Again, on day 4, there was an emotional collapse of one of the inmates. This time it was prisoner 819. A Catholic priest was brought in to speak with the inmates, but prisoner 819 refused to speak with him and instead demanded a medical doctor. Zimbardo took 819 aside into a separate room to try and calm the student down. While in this separate room, the guards led the other prisoners in a loud synchronized chant of 819 did a bad thing. Despite being in a separate room, the participant could hear the chants clearly, and when he heard his fellow inmates decry him as a bad person, 819 broke down completely. Zimbardo had to intervene by reminding the student of his actual name and identity before releasing him from the experiment with pay. In only 4 short days, the boundary between role and identity had already begun to break down for prisoners and guards alike. Day 5 brought the experiment to its psychological peak. The guards' behavior had become more and more sadistic, and external observers began to challenge the study's morality. Day 5 was a bit of a landmark day on the original schedule. This was visitation day, where the inmates could have family and friends visit them in the mock prison. However, this was done as a part of the simulation, so Zimbardo had constructed a rule set that mimicked how visitations in actual prisons worked at the time. Visitors were forced to wait for long periods of time before getting to see the person that they had come to visit. They were restricted to only 2 visitors per prisoner, and the visitation was only allowed to last for 10 minutes and under armed guard surveillance. This caused a significant amount of distress among parents. Some of them had even planned to contact lawyers to secure an early release from the experiment. It was during this visitation period that a colleague of Zimbardo's, Gordon Boer, visited the site and began to question Zimbardo on the basic scientific parameters of the study, specifically asking what the independent variable of the study was. Cracks were beginning to form in the experiment, and these deepened that night with what Zimbardo described as an unthinkable way to humiliate all prisoners. One of the guards, David Eshelman, who had been nicknamed John Wayne, came up with the most egregious instance of humiliation. Eshelman ordered the inmates to pretend that they were camels and forced them to simulate sodomy while the guards laughed hysterically. The distinction between students in a study and prisoners had completely dissolved, and at this point the prisoners were not even human in the eyes of the guards. Zimbardo himself would later say that he had become so engrossed in the experiment that by the 5th night, the scheduled 10 p.m. toilet run was nothing more than a check mark on his daily schedule rather than a moment of human suffering. In only 5 short days, a group of regular, everyday college students that had all been psychologically evaluated as not having any forms of sociopathy or psychopathy had become monstrously sadistic. The lead investigator of the study had gone from being an academic recording data to a prison superintendent that was bent on ensuring the prison ran efficiently. And finally, late in the evening of day 5, the voice of reason finally broke through. Zimbardo's girlfriend, Christina Maslock, visited the basement and found that the prisoners had bags over their heads and were being tormented. Maslock was outraged and confronted Zimbardo in a major heated argument. Essentially, she told him that the experiment had transformed him into someone who was indifferent to student suffering, and as a bottom line told Zimbardo that if he did not come to his senses, their relationship was done. This served as a wake-up call for Zimbardo, one that was much needed, and led him to the decision to end the experiment the following morning. With the start of day 6, Zimbardo announced to all participants that the experiment was being ended early and arranged payments to all participants for the 6 days that they spent in the experiment. Zimbardo then conducted several hours of debriefing to help the students process the experience. He met with the prisoners first, and then the guards, and finally he brought everyone together to share their feelings and observations. I can only imagine the tensions when they were all brought together, as well as the feelings of anger and shame. Participants were also asked to complete a personal retrospective of their time in the prison that would then be mailed back to the researchers at a later time. Additionally, they were all invited to return 1 week later to further discuss their emotions and opinions. Once the participants had left, the mock prison, known as Stanford County Jail, was completely dismantled, and the basement was once again returned to its original function as graduate student offices. After that, the final task of compiling data began. This included reviewing hours of video recordings, audio logs, and personal diaries. The information from all of these sources would eventually form the basis for scholarly articles and Zimbardo's detailed review in his book, The Lucifer Effect. After the results of the experiment were published, the Stanford Prison Experiment had ripple effects throughout the prison management system, legal standards, and even military training. It highlighted how systematic and situational forces drive abusive behavior more than individual character does. The most direct impact of the experiment's findings was on juvenile detention laws. In 1973, Zimbardo provided expert testimony to a congressional subcommittee regarding the dangers of imprisonment on the human mind, which helped with passing of a federal law that prohibited housing juveniles in pretrial detention with adult prisoners to prevent abuse and violence. It has also been used to promote more humane prison environments by emphasizing the need for proper guard training and clearly established rules. The study's conclusions suggested that without oversight and defined regulations, the power of the situation would inevitably lead to dehumanization. The findings have also been integrated, as I said, into specialized military training to prevent the very abuses the study documented. The U.S. Navy and other military units use footage from the experiment in search, evasion, resistance, and escape, or SEER training, as a cautionary tale to warn personnel of how easily people can cross the line from play acting to becoming actual torturers during high-stress interrogation simulations. Perhaps they should have done more in terms of educating military units, though. In April of 2004, CBS News and The New Yorker published photographs that showed soldiers grinning alongside naked, hooded, and tormented prisoners. The photographs were from a U.S. military-run prison in Abu Ghraib, Iraq, which is just a short distance west of Baghdad. After the news broke of this scandal, members of the U.S. Army and of the CIA were arrested on charges of human rights violations and war crimes. At the time of the arrest, a statement from the White House insisted that the events were isolated incidents caused by a few, quote, bad apples, while humanitarian groups and subsequent reports argued that the abuse was part of a systematic pattern of enhanced interrogation which had been sanctioned by the U.S. government. During the trial of Sergeant Ivan Chip Frederick, Zimbardo himself served as an expert witness, arguing that Sergeant Frederick wasn't a bad apple, but that the systematic and situational forces were a bad barrel that corrupted the soldiers involved, that they weren't bad apples, they were apples placed in a bad barrel. There are several parallels between the Stanford experiment and the events at Abu Ghraib. First is the de-individualization and anonymity. In the experiment, the guards wore khaki uniforms and mirrored sunglasses to prevent eye contact and reduce personal accountability. At Abu Ghraib, guards often stopped wearing full uniforms, and the sheer volume of indistinguishable naked or orange jumpsuited prisoners created an extreme state of anonymity and de-individualization. The Stanford Prison Experiment prisoners were stripped, addressed only by ID numbers, and forced to wear smocks. Abu Ghraib guards took this even further, referring to detainees as dogs and kept them hooded. They were even forced to crawl on the floor while soldiers, quote, rode them like donkeys. In both the experiment and in the scandal, sexual humiliation was prevalent, and the experiment even mirrored many of the photographed abuses at Abu Ghraib, where detainees were forced into human pyramids and many other despicable acts. An important note on this is that in both the prison experiment and the situation at Abu Ghraib, the worst abuses occurred during the night shift when guards felt less observed by authority figures, as there was not adequate oversight. In the experiment, Zimbardo's team instructed guards to be tough and to create a sense of powerlessness. And at Abu Ghraib, there have been documents discovered authorizing certain coercive tactics, and that private contractors had instructed military police to, quote, soften up prisoners for interrogation. Zimbardo often explained the relationship between these events by stating that if you place a sweet cucumber into a vinegar barrel, the acidity of the barrel, the system in this case, will inevitably turn the cucumber into a pickle. So his opinion is that the soldiers were not necessarily born as bad apples, as the White House had proclaimed them to be, but were instead placed into a toxic barrel designed to produce the very rot that was later witnessed by the world. As with most psychological studies and experiments, the findings are heavily scrutinized, and as more is understood about the human mind and human behavior, criticisms rise, and the Stanford Prison Experiment is absolutely no different. Here are the primary current criticisms of the experiment. First, we have researcher manipulation and direct instructions. One recent researcher argues that the sadistic behavior of the guards was not a spontaneous reaction to the environment, but was directly encouraged by the research team. As I mentioned before, the warden, David Jaffe, told a soft guard that he needed to toughen his actions for the success of the experiment. Zimbardo acknowledges these instructions, but maintains that they were mild and did not mandate brutality of any kind. Next, many critics argue that the participants were simply acting out stereotypes of how they thought prisoners and guards should behave in order to please the researchers. The most notable mention here was the guard nicknamed John Wayne. According to this guard, he was intentionally play acting and modeled his persona on the warden from the movie Cool Hand Luke in order to make the experiment work. There were also faked breakdowns like the one I mentioned regarding Douglas Corpy. Corpy still maintains that his breakdown was faked as a means of getting him out of the experiment in order to study for an exam, and Zimbardo still maintains that the breakdown was 100% real. Another critique of the experiment is that there was biased data collection and even pre-written conclusions. Less than 15% of the experiment was actually recorded, and the research team primarily filled cinematic or dramatic moments while ignoring mundane interactions. Others claim that Zimbardo designed the experiment as a demonstration for advocacy rather than as a neutral experiment, and that he had written his conclusions regarding the toxicity of prisons as early as the second day of the experiment. More claims point towards selection bias when the participants were being recruited. Critics argue that because the original recruitment ad in the newspapers sought volunteers for a psychological study of prison life, that would inevitably attract participants that scored higher on traits like aggressiveness, authoritarianism, and even narcissism. And of course, like so many historical psychological experiments and studies, there were major ethical violations, and the study is still frequently cited as a landmark of unethical research. Participants were told that they could leave at any time, but Zimbardo frequently refused requests to withdraw unless it was a medical or psychiatric emergency. There was also a lack of informed consent due to participants not being fully informed about the mock arrests by real police in their homes, which violated the researchers' own contracts. I will also note here that the study was approved beforehand by the Stanford Human Subjects Research Committee. Today, such a study would never be approved, which is a testament to just how far ethics standards have come since even just the 1970s. There has also been a failure to replicate the study. In 2002, Alex Haslam and Stephen Reicher failed to replicate Zimbardo's results during the BBC prison study. In this study, the guards did not automatically become tyrannical, and the prisoners organized effectively to resist and eventually dominate the guards. Zimbardo dismissed this as simply reality TV, but the BBC study remains a significant challenge to the idea that people mindlessly slip into roles. So with all of the criticisms of the results of the original Stanford Prison Experiment, do we discount the entire thing as fantasy? What can we possibly learn from it? Well, I guess that's my cue to interject my own personal thoughts and impressions here. At the time of the incident in Abu Ghraib, I was actually just miles away from that very prison while on my own deployment within Iraq. While I didn't have the experience of serving as a prison guard for detainees, I did have interactions with Iraqi people and have since realized that there are a lot of factors that can contribute to someone's state of mind and treatment of other people. And it's something that we have to be extremely mindful of in our own actions. With being deployed somewhere like Iraq, there's a natural toxic environment that can be experienced. In my case, and many others, I didn't want to be there. I didn't believe in the reasons that we had been deployed there, and I felt that I should be home with my family rather than sitting in Iraq. So already there was a foundation of toxicity. And then there were the news reports of contractors in Iraq being beheaded that created a stronger feeling of animosity and resentment toward the people that were doing this, which was a natural and valid enough mindset. However, we didn't have specific people to point the finger at. All we knew was that they were people outside of the U.S. military and that they were indigenous to Iraq or the Middle East. So any Iraqi that we saw could potentially be a hostile person. Soon the associations were forming that I was stuck there away from my family in a place I might not ever get to leave because of these people. And leadership often had the same or similar views. Disparaging language starts getting used out of frustration and anger. Essentially, the Iraqi people were starting to appear to me as hostile, uncivilized, and possibly even somewhat less human than I was. So in that sense, I can understand to some degree how the foundations of this behavior began for the service members at Abu Ghraib. And it could have been even more compounded for them because they were members of the National Guard rather than active duty Army. The difference there, for those that don't know, is that active duty military is your job every day of the week. For the National Guard, they are only part-time typically. One of the only times that they're not part-time is when they're deployed to a combat zone. So these folks are not military day in and day out. They're lawyers, truck drivers, bartenders, and every other profession you can think of that sometimes puts on a uniform. For active duty, being deployed is a daily concern and possibility. For National Guard, the threat's always there, but it just feels much more distant. So for them to be deployed, there is the chance that they could build resentment faster and much more strongly because they had to leave their civilian lives to fulfill a military role. Now, in saying this, I am in no way condoning anything that they had done. While I may have started to view the Iraqi people as somewhat less human than myself and my military comrades, I never did anything inhumane to them, especially to the degree of the guards at Abu Ghraib. To get to the point, they had to have a failure in leadership and oversight, as well as made failed choices. Remember from the Milgram obedience episode, just because you're ordered to do something doesn't mean that you should do it, that the unlawful order somehow excuses your own guilt. You have a responsibility as a human being to recognize these things within yourself, adjust your moral compass back to where it should be, and stand up for what's right, regardless of the consequences. Along with this example, I see similar things playing out in ways that I'm not sure very many people make the same associations. Over at least the last decade, attention has really been drawn to law enforcement and acts of civil rights violations and violence against minorities of races other than the officers involved. To a degree, I can see this situation the same way that Zimbardo described prisons. You can't put sweet cucumber into a barrel of vinegar and expect a cucumber to not turn into a pickle. Someone might join the police force with the best of intentions, but over time they're subjected to working in areas of high crime, especially when the officer is not the same ethnic background as the majority of people in that certain area. A certain level of resentment can begin to build. It's compounded when the interactions of the officer are, due to the nature of his or her job, with the criminal element, and they rarely get to interact with the law-abiding people. These types of circumstances can incorrectly form associations. When others around that officer are also experiencing this, the associations deepen and can lead to some of the worst incidents involving law enforcement. Now, don't get me wrong here. Again, I'm not condoning or trying to make any excuses to allow for behavior or actions like this. I'm simply trying to understand the minds and situations of how things like this can happen. I'm not trying to say that there aren't any violent or racist members of law enforcement, because there most certainly is. These people exist in all races, all professions, and all over the world. But what I am saying is that not every instance is due to a tendency toward racism, but is often the result of these negative associations that are incorrectly built in people's minds. And what would the solution here be? Well, oversight is always a necessity, as I pointed out before with the night shifts at the prison experiment and at Abu Ghraib. Training is also something that needs to be mandatory, and it needs to be frequent. I also think that psychological evaluations should be mandatory on a periodical basis to watch for shifts in someone's views on any one particular group. Another argument I've made in the past, and I still stand by despite the issues that come along with it, would be that law enforcement should be on a patrol location rotation. When the same officers patrol a certain neighborhood over long periods of time, say years, even decades, this kind of resentment and negative associations can really build. To help curb that, I believe that officers should instead rotate from high crime areas to extremely low crime areas for brief periods of time. Allow for a breath of fresh air to reconnect with the good in humanity before going back to the bad side of humanity. This, I believe, will help most officers maintain a view of humanity rather than fostering dehumanizing thoughts. The counter-argument that I have heard is that law enforcement works for long periods of time to establish relationships with people in a community. They might gain the trust of someone that doesn't trust other officers, so rotating them out breaks that relationship. But I think that if law enforcement were to be on some kind of rotation like this, there would be less negative actions by law enforcement, which would begin to rebuild some trust that communities have in law enforcement that otherwise do not have that level of trust now. Now, I also want to say that I don't propose that these are the only solutions to the problem, but I think that taking steps like this, along with other proposed solutions, would go a long way to fixing one of the worst issues we have in society right now. I think it's easy to see the world in a binary sense. Up and down, right and wrong, left and right, yes and no, and most importantly, good and bad. But there's room in between. Not everything can fit neatly and cleanly into one category or another. While Zimbardo's experiment might be receiving large amounts of criticism for manipulation and direct instructions, isn't that exactly what we would expect to see in a toxic environment? Nor does the play acting, because when people step into a new job, isn't that exactly what they typically do? Play act the stereotype of that job until they get a feel for it? In my eyes, the Stanford Prison Experiment is still exceptionally valid and has implications beyond the prison system. We can look at areas where authority and power come into play, especially when certain traits emerge, such as high crime rates, lower economic standards, ethnicity, and so on, and identify these things to determine the potential for bad associations to be made and build a plan from there to help reduce people from making poor choices based on the environment that they find themselves in that may be turning them into a pickle, to use Zimbardo's imagery. And with that, I think I will wrap up things for this week. I hope you all have enjoyed this week's topic, or at least found it thought-provoking. The Stanford Prison Experiment has long been an interesting one to me that I find myself reflecting on to help understand how behavior can get shaped. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the topic and on my own insights. Please feel free to leave a comment in the podcast app that you listen from, or send an email directly to me at hello@yourmindonpodcast.com. Next week, we have our first episode on a topic that has been suggested to me by someone that has listened to the podcast. What is gaslighting? How do people use the technique of gaslighting? Is gaslighting even a real thing? Am I gaslighting you right now? Tune in next week to find out more. As always, please feel free to reach out with comments, questions, or topic suggestions to hello@yourmindonpodcast.com or via Instagram @yourmindonpodcast. You can also visit www.yourmindonpodcast.com to learn more about the show, stream episodes directly from your browser, and to even learn more about who I am. And be sure to leave a rating in your preferred listening app. The more ratings, the more listeners will come, and that'll allow me to focus more on creating great episodes to share with all of you. Once again, thank you for listening today. I'm John Shaw, and remember, understanding your mind is the first step to changing your life. Until next time, be kind to yourself.